You know that incredibly specific, really sinking feeling you get these days when you first open your eyes in the
Oh,
morning?
yeah, before you've even had a chance to get out of bed.
Right. You haven't moved, maybe you're just reaching for that first cup of coffee, and you make the absolute mistake of glancing at the news notifications on your phone?
It's never a good idea.
It's really not.
Yeah.
Suddenly, it feels less like you're reading the morning headlines and more like you're, I don't know, watching the entire geopolitical fabric of the world unravel in real time. It is genuinely overwhelming.
It is.
You see these cascading alerts about conflicts spreading across different continents, massive diplomatic breakdowns between nuclear powers, dire economic warnings flashing red. And the absolute easiest, most natural human reaction is to just want to close the app, look away, and pretend none of it is actually happening.
Which is a completely fair trauma response, honestly.
Exactly. But if you're listening to this right now, you also have that undeniable, almost compulsive desire to actually understand the why behind all this chaos. You want to grasp the underlying architecture of what's going wrong without feeling totally paralyzed by the sheer volume of information. And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today,
We are taking a massive stack of noise and trying to distill it down to the core signal.
which is a daunting task.
It is a really daunting task,
Yeah.
honestly, but it's an absolutely necessary one if we want to move past just, reacting emotionally to the 24-hour news cycle. We are looking at a global landscape that is shifting and fracturing so much faster than traditional analytical models can even track.
Mm.
The old paradigms of the post-Cold War era simply do not apply to what we're witnessing right now.
And to make sense of that shift, we are focusing today's deep dive on unpacking a single, highly provocative, and incredibly dense piece of source material. We were looking at a recent, really expansive interview featuring Professor Jeffrey Sachs speaking with Glenn Deason.
And before we get into the weeds of the history and the strategy here, we need to be crystal clear about the sheer, terrifying scale of what Sachs is arguing.
Yeah, he is making a massive, sobering claim that frames everything else we're going to talk about today. He asserts that we are currently, right this very second, in the early days of World War III.
Right. And because that is such a heavy premise, it is vital. We set some ground rules for our discussion today. The source material we're examining is packed with intense, highly controversial, and very politically charged claims.
Sachs is pulling absolutely no punches.
None at all. He is intensely critical of multiple governments taking direct aim at the United States, various European nations, and Israel and their respective leaderships. So our job today is not to endorse his worldview or to take a political side. We are not here to debate whether his assessments are morally right or wrong.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. Our purpose is to operate as your guides through his logic. We want to map out his arguments and dissect the very specific historical dots he is connecting so that you can fully understand this comprehensive worldview he's presenting, regardless of where you personally land on the political spectrum.
I think that's the perfect framing, because Sachs doesn't just casually throw out a term like World War III for shock value. He builds a really systematic case for it. Okay, let's unpack this. He starts with the immediate crisis unraveling in the Middle East, specifically concerning Iran.
Right.
When I was going through his breakdown of the situation, what stood out wasn't just his description of the violence, but his characterization of the strategy, or rather, according to him, the terrifying lack of one.
Yes, the fog of war.
Exactly. According to Sachs, what we are witnessing is essentially a massive regime change operation that has gone severely off the rails. He argues that Washington is currently engulfed in this fog of war.
It's really interesting he uses that specific phrase because traditionally we think of fog of war as a battlefield term, the uncertainty a commander faces regarding enemy movements or the terrain. But Sachs is applying it to the very apex of political and strategic leadership.
He's saying the confusion goes all the way to the top.
He argues that what we are seeing out of Washington isn't just strategic classified secrecy where they know exactly what they're doing but just aren't telling the public. He's suggesting there is a profound structural confusion at the highest levels, a complete detachment from realistic expectations, shifting and contradictory war aims, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the reality on the ground in the Middle East.
Yeah, he points to the public statements coming out of the U.S., and he specifically singles out Donald Trump's social media posts and rhetoric as erratic and impulsive, rather than representing any kind of cohesive long-term military or diplomatic strategy.
And he gets into some very specific, almost bizarre tactical anomalies to highlight just how convoluted this conflict has become.
Like the Iran situation.
Right. He brings up this incredibly confusing dynamic where Iran is publicly taking credit for hitting U.S. military bases. But in the exact same breath, they're explicitly denying any involvement in attacks on Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey.
Which, if you're just skimming the headline, seems entirely contradictory. Why would you claim the direct strike on the global superpower but vehemently deny the regional strikes?
This is where Sachs's analysis gets into the darker, more complex mechanics of modern hybrid warfare. He posits that this discrepancy, Iran selectively claiming and denying operations, suggests a massive covert layer to the conflict. He theorizes that the U.S. and Israel might actually be attempting to pull in regional proxy forces to do the fighting or to frame the narrative.
He specifically mentions the Kurdish fighters, right?
Yes, he mentions the arming and utilization of Kurdish fighters as a proxy element in this wider regional destabilization. But the implication that truly elevates the risk profile is his discussion of the intelligence networks. He brings up the persistent argument circulating that Russia is actively providing Iran with high-level intelligence.
Which, if you think about the mechanics of modern warfare, is a massive structural escalation. I mean, it's one thing to sell weapons to a country. It's another entirely to plug a regional power directly into a superpower satellite and surveillance network.
Precisely. And Sachs draws a direct, unavoidable parallel here. He compares this potential Russian-Iranian dynamic straight back to the United States, providing real-time targeting intelligence to Ukraine against Russian forces.
Tit for tat.
Exactly. He argues that following Western strikes on Iranian leadership or critical assets, Moscow feels immense strategic pressure to restore its own deterrence. In their calculus, if NATO can use Ukraine to bleed Russia, Russia can use Iran to bleed the U.S. and its allies.
It is this exact web of plausible deniability, proxy actions, and deep state intelligence sharing that Sachs argues turns what looks like a regional Middle Eastern conflict into the opening theater of a global war.
And that global linkage is the absolute core of his World War III thesis. He refuses to view the Middle East in isolation.
Right. If you're listening to this and wondering, how does a missile strike in Iran fundamentally alter the rest of the globe? Well, Sachs lays out the flashpoints like a string of dominoes. He connects the ongoing, grinding war in Ukraine, the simmering historical tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
And he even drags the Western Hemisphere into the equation.
He does. He points out that Trump is signaling potential moves to exert control over or even take over Cuba.
It's a remarkably broad aperture. He also notes a very specific, underreported incident where an Iranian naval vessel was reportedly sunk off the coast of India.
Now, if we look at that isolated event through Sachs's lens, the implication for you, the listener, is profound. These are not random, disconnected geopolitical flare-ups happening in a vacuum. According to Sachs's framework, they are linked by a singular, overarching American strategy.
He argues the entire machine is driving toward one specific goal, which is control. But not just territorial control in the 20th century sense. He's talking about the strategy to absolutely corner and control global energy markets.
He says that much of the vast, chaotic maneuvering by the U.S. is fundamentally aimed at targeting and choking off the energy supplies destined for its primary geopolitical rival, which is China.
Right. He points to the relentless sanctions and efforts to cut off Venezuelan oil to Beijing, the massive structural attempts to restrict Russian oil and gas following the Ukraine invasion, and now the kinetic moves to cut off Iranian energy supplies.
It is essentially an economic siege on a global scale. Sachs is warning that because of this strategy, this deliberate systemic disruption of global energy flows, which includes the literal physical destruction of energy infrastructure, we are accelerating toward an extraordinarily severe worldwide energy crisis.
And he uses a term borrowed from finance that should give anyone pause. He states that this impending crisis hasn't been priced into the markets yet.
I found that phrase chilling because it translates to something very tangible for the everyday person. When financial analysts say a risk isn't priced in, it means the grand apparatus of global economics, the stock markets, the commodities exchanges, the corporate forecasts, they are all operating under an illusion of stability that is about to shatter.
Sachs is suggesting that your future cost of living, the baseline price of fuel required to transport every good you buy, the fundamental stability of global trade networks, none of these systems have accounted for the sheer scale of the energy shock that this interconnected multi-front conflict is inevitably going to produce.
He's forecasting a scenario that will severely damage European industrial capacity, deeply threaten Asian economic growth, and sequentially trigger even more conflict as nations scramble for dwindling resources.
And this brings us to the geopolitical reaction to this energy chokehold. How do the other superpowers respond to being cornered? Sachs points directly to the cementing of the China-Russia-Iran dynamic. He argues that it would run counter to all geopolitical logic and basic survival instinct if China and Russia didn't throw their full weight behind Iran in this scenario.
Because it's a matter of absolute strategic dependency. China's massive industrial engine relies heavily on Iranian and Russian hydrocarbons. If, as Sachs argues, the United States is waging a multi-pronged economic and proxy war designed explicitly to sever China from its energy lifelines, then Beijing standing by passively while Washington consolidates total control over global energy markets would be tantamount to national suicide.
It's an unavoidable domino effect.
Yeah.
Pushing militarily and economically on Iran inevitably forces China and Russia to push back, solidifying this global fracture.
That is the physical economic battlefield. But where Sachs's analysis becomes truly structural is when he moves from the physical battleground to the institutional one. Here's where it gets really interesting.
He argues that the joint U.S. and Israeli actions against Iran represent something far larger than a regional power play. He views it as a calculated direct attack on the very concept of multipolarity, and more specifically, the deliberate dismantling of the United Nations and the framework of international law itself.
He doesn't mince words here. He argues that the current U.S. administration and arguably the broader foreign policy establishment views the United Nations not as a necessary forum for global cooperation, but as an intolerable obstacle to its own unipolar power.
He uses this incredibly evocative phrase, suggesting the U.S. strategy is to kill the UN through 1,000 cuts and a devastating blow.
And he backs this assertion up with a litany of structural examples. He points out that the U.S. has systematically walked out of or defunded more than 30 UN agencies over the years.
He cites the unilateral repudiation of foundational stabilizing treaties, most notably the withdrawal from critical nuclear arms control agreements, which were the very pillars of the UN's global security system. He also mentions the chronic withholding of financial dues as a leveraging tactic.
He even brings up the rhetoric surrounding the military itself to illustrate this mindset. He quotes sentiments aligned with figures like Pete Hegseth, noting how established international rules of engagement are increasingly dismissed in U.S. discourse as being merely politically correct or indicative of weakness.
Sachs points out that the prevailing view in Washington treats UN rules and international law as pathetic niceties in a world of power.
Pathetic niceties. It highlights a fundamental, irreconcilable clash of worldviews. Sachs's core argument is that if a nation genuinely believes it is the absolute global hegemon, the sole, unchallengeable superpower, then any international body that attempts to bind it with universal rules or demands co-responsibility with weaker nations is inherently viewed as illegitimate and restrictive.
And he actually tries to quantify this isolation. It's not just a philosophical critique. Sachs and his colleagues compile an annual index called the Sustainable Development Report. One of the metrics it tracks is essentially how aligned a nation is with UN-based multilateralism. Out of all 193 UN member states, he points out that the United States ranks at the absolute bottom of this index.
Which is a striking data point. He argues it isn't even a close margin. The U.S., according to his metrics, is the least aligned nation on Earth when it comes to the UN framework.
He points to the voting records in the General Assembly, noting that on critical resolutions regarding global security or human rights frameworks, the U.S. frequently finds itself voting in a tiny, profoundly isolated minority.
Often it's just the U.S., Israel, Paraguay, and perhaps a handful of island nations voting against the overwhelming, express will of the rest of the global community.
To really grasp why Sachs finds this systemic dismantling so terrifying, you have to look at the foundational architecture that was put in place after the horrors of World War II. He constantly points people back to the core of the UN Charter, specifically urging everyone to read Article 2, Paragraph 4.
It is the absolute linchpin of modern international law. Article 2, Paragraph 4 explicitly forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state.
The very preamble of the Charter states its entire reason for existing is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It exists precisely to criminalize the historical norm, where powerful nations simply used violence and conquest as standard instruments of diplomacy and control.
But Sachs's argument is that the current U.S. approach doesn't just bend this rule, it completely bypasses it, treating it as if it applies to everyone else but Washington.
He points out that in the context of Iran, the administration's rhetoric essentially demands unconditional surrender and assumes that the United States has the inherent sovereign right to simply dictate or pick the next leader of a foreign nation, using whatever force necessary until that outcome is achieved.
From his perspective, this is a total repudiation of the very concept that international law applies to the American hegemon.
He is asserting that the U.S. operates with a sneering disregard for co-responsibility. And this institutional critique seamlessly transitions into his highly controversial psychological profiling of American leadership, which is where the source material gets intensely personal.
Yeah, we have to talk about the language he uses regarding Donald Trump, because he frequently refers to him with the moniker Emperor Donald. Sachs isn't just offering a standard political critique of Trump's policies, he is explicitly profiling him using clinical psychological terminology.
He assigns traits of the dark triad to Trump's leadership style, specifically calling out malignant narcissism, Machiavellianism, and megalomania.
It's important to unpack what those terms mean in this geopolitical context. The dark triad refers to personality traits characterized by manipulation, an absolute lack of empathy, and an obsession with self-interest and dominance.
By applying this to a world leader, Sachs is suggesting that the decision-making process is entirely divorced from traditional diplomacy or ethical considerations, and is instead driven by an insatiable need for personal power and historical grandiosity.
He actually goes so far as to compare the territorial and hegemonic ambitions currently on display to historical conquerors like Napoleon or Hitler, but he makes a terrifying distinction. While those historical figures aim to conquer their respective neighborhoods or continents, the ambition of the modern American hegemon, currently helmed by this personality type, is entirely global. There is no geographic limit to the desired control.
What's fascinating here is how Sachs connects this erratic personality to the deeper, permanent institutions of power. Because it would be comforting in a way to just say, well, this specific leader is an erratic anomaly, and once he's gone, the system will self-correct. But Sachs completely rejects that comforting narrative.
Right. He argues that while Trump's rhetoric is uniquely grandiose, personal, and highly unpredictable, he is ultimately just the current figurehead sitting on top of a massive, deeply entrenched machine that has existed for decades.
Sachs posits that United States foreign policy hasn't been run by democratic consensus or even traditional State Department diplomacy for a very long time. He argues it has been fundamentally driven by the CIA and the broader intelligence apparatus, which he describes not as information-gathering agencies, but as massive, off-the-book militaries.
This changes the entire context of the rhetoric we hear today. So when a modern president casually states that the U.S. is going to dictate the supreme leader of Iran, Sachs says that while it sounds absolutely loony and unhinged to the average citizen, historically speaking, it's just the standard, usually classified operating procedure of the U.S. security state finally being spoken out loud on social media.
To validate this massive claim, Sachs doesn't just gesture vaguely at the deep state. He traces a very specific, detailed historical timeline to demonstrate how this covert machinery has consistently operated to dismantle multipolarity over the decades.
I really want to dig into this timeline because it fundamentally reframes how you process the news today. He starts his historical anchor in 1953 with Iran.
The 1953 coup in Iran is ground zero for this argument. The CIA, alongside British intelligence, orchestrated the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because Mossadegh had the audacity to nationalize Iran's oil industry, threatening Anglo-American corporate control.
Sachs emphasizes that the U.S. didn't just remove a leader, they installed a brutal police state under the Shah. They unilaterally chose who would lead a sovereign nation, completely subverting international norms.
And Sachs points out the profound generational blowback of that single covert action. The U.S. heavily backed that oppressive police state for over 25 years, which directly fueled the fury that exploded into the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
So when we look at the crisis in the Middle East today, Sachs is arguing that the roots of this current anti-American hostility are directly, inextricably planted in a CIA operation from 70 years ago. We are dealing with the ghosts of 1953.
From there, Sachs moves the timeline to 1961, focusing on President Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous farewell address. Most people know this as the speech where Eisenhower warned the American public about the encroaching dangers of the military-industrial complex.
But Sachs's interpretation of that speech is much darker than the standard high school history version. He points out that Eisenhower was a five-star general, a man who intimately understood the machinery of war.
Sachs argues that this wasn't a prophetic warning about something that might happen in the distant future if we weren't careful. He reads Eisenhower's address as a tragic admission to the public that the battle had already been lost, that the democratic institutions of government had already been fundamentally subverted, and a permanent, unaccountable military security state was already firmly in control of the nation's destiny.
Which perfectly sets the stage for his most controversial historical claim on this timeline. 1963. Sachs states his belief that the evidence is overwhelming that the CIA orchestrated the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
And it's crucial to understand that Sachs doesn't present this as a fringe, flamboyant conspiracy theory for entertainment. He frames it as the pivotal, explanatory turning point in modern global history.
He argues that JFK was the last American president who genuinely substantively attempted to take on the security state and push the world toward a cooperative, multipolar peace. You think about Kennedy's push for the partial nuclear test ban treaty, or his American University speech calling for genuine peace with the Soviet Union. Sachs views these as direct threats to the CIA's Hobbesian worldview.
According to Sachs's framework, Kennedy was eliminated from the inside, specifically because of those peace initiatives. And the chilling conclusion he draws is that every single president since 1963, from Lyndon Johnson immediately reversing Kennedy's de-escalation in Vietnam, all the way through the decades to Obama and Biden, has fundamentally understood the true power dynamic and has essentially capitulated to the agenda of the U.S. security state, continuing the endless cycle of covert regime change operations.
He brings this historical through line right up to the modern era, pointing specifically to the events in Ukraine in 2014. He cites the infamous leaked phone call involving Victoria Nuland, who was a high-ranking official in the State Department at the time.
In this recording, caught on an unsecure line during the chaotic political upheaval in Kyiv, Nuland is heard literally strategizing and essentially picking who would lead the new Ukrainian government, specifically naming Arseniy Yatsenyuk as the preferred choice.
The famous Yats is the guy, quote, "When you synthesize this timeline, the blatant overthrow in 1953, Iran, the grim admission by Eisenhower in 1961, the alleged institutional coup of 1963, and the casual geopolitical engineering in 2014, Ukraine, Sachs's overarching thesis becomes impossible to ignore."
His point is that the concept of the United States covertly picking leaders, destabilizing regions, and imposing governments is not some recent anomaly introduced by hawkish modern administrations. It is, and has been for decades, the core operating DNA of the U.S. empire.
He actually uses a fascinating historical analogy to describe this structural reality. He questions when the U.S. Republic officially transitioned into a U.S. empire. He compares the American trajectory to the Roman Republic in 27 BC, when Augustus effectively became the first emperor.
Sachs points out that in Rome, after that shift, the Senate still met. The senators still wore their togas. They still held debates. It fundamentally looked like a republic. But the actual power structure, the monopoly on violence and decision-making, had permanently shifted to the emperor and the military.
Sachs theorizes that the American Republic may have actually ended in November 1963. We've been living inside a functioning empire ever since, even though all the Democratic window dressing the elections, the congressional debates, the cable news panels is still firmly in place to make us feel like we're in a republic.
This creates an incredibly volatile, dangerous reality today. You have this massive, entrenched, militaristic deep state that has been running global regime change operations in the shadows for over half a century.
And now, according to Sachs's psychological profile, sitting at the very top of that lethal machine is a leader driven by extreme personal megalomania who operates without a filter, shouting the quiet, covert parts out loud to the entire world. The friction between an erratic, narcissistic figurehead and a deeply established, lethal bureaucratic machine is creating unprecedented global unpredictability.
So, if we accept this premise that the U.S. is acting unilaterally as an unaccountable global hegemon, the obvious next question is, how is the rest of the so-called Western alliance reacting to this?
We constantly hear rhetoric about the unbreakable bond between the U.S. and Europe. Well, according to Sachs, Europe's reaction is nothing short of catastrophic. He is absolutely scathing in his assessment. He calls the current crop of European leaders the weakest leadership in generations.
He draws a very sharp, very painful historical contrast between the leaders running Europe today and the monumental figures who rebuilt the continent after World War II. He brings up the original architects of the European project, visionary thinkers like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, and subsequent political giants like Charles de Gaulle, François Mitterrand, Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, and Helmut Kohl.
These were leaders who had personally lived through the unimaginable devastation of a continent tearing itself apart. They understood in their bones that the ultimate non-negotiable goal of the European project was structural peace and collective independent security.
They had a backbone. They had a distinct European vision that didn't always perfectly align with Washington.
But when Sachs surveys the current landscape figures like the former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz or Friedrich Merz, Ursula von der Leyen at the EU, and Emmanuel Macron in France, he sees a generation of politicians who have entirely abandoned that foundational peace project.
He uses a very specific, loaded historical term to describe their current relationship with the United States. He calls them vassals.
The term vassal is incredibly deliberate. It implies total subservience, an oath of fealty, and a complete lack of independent strategic autonomy.
Sachs argues that Europe has structurally lost its identity. Rather than acting as a moderating, mature force on the global stage, or standing up as the primary defenders of the UN Charter and international law, European leadership is blindly, almost cheerfully, falling into line behind American militarism, even when it directly contradicts their own economic and security interests.
He is particularly ruthless when it comes to analyzing Germany, which makes perfect sense. Germany is the industrial and economic engine of the European Union. As Germany goes, so goes Europe. While he dismisses Olaf Scholz as largely a non-entity in terms of global influence, he reserves his absolute harshest critique for Friedrich Merz.
Sachs describes Merz using terms like belligerent, ignorant, and warmongering. He essentially accuses the German leadership of failing in their most fundamental, existential duty to their own people and to the continent.
If the current approach is failing, what does Sachs argue that duty should actually look like?
Real diplomacy. Uncomfortable diplomacy. Sachs argues that the absolute primary job of the German chancellor should have been to pick up the phone, call President Putin directly, and begin the agonizingly hard work of negotiating and rebuilding some framework of collective security on the European continent to head off this disastrous war.
Instead, Sachs sees leaders like Merz fawning over American power, while simultaneously pushing for a terrifying reversion to German militarism, completely ignoring the historical trauma that entails.
And Sachs didn't just read about this European subservience in the papers. He witnessed it firsthand recently, in a setting that makes the whole situation feel almost surreal.
He tells this incredible anecdote from a United Nations Security Council meeting he attended. This wasn't just any meeting. This was the session convened the very day after the joint U.S. and Israeli military strike on Iran.
In any rational world, you would expect that in the UN Security Council, the highest forum dedicated to maintaining international law, an unprovoked kinetic attack by one sovereign nation on another would be the absolute singular focus of the discussion.
But Sachs describes a scene that borders on mass delusion. He sat there and watched as one European ambassador after another took the microphone and spent their allotted time aggressively berating Iran.
He notes the shocking reality that most of these highly educated diplomats completely failed to even acknowledge the initial missile attack launched by the U.S. and Israel that had occurred mere hours prior. It was as if the initiating act of violence simply didn't exist in their shared reality, and only the Iranian response or potential response was worthy of condemnation.
It is a staggering illustration of the complete collapse of objective international law in the minds of the Western diplomatic corps. But Sachs zeroes in on one specific, darkly comedic interaction from that meeting that perfectly encapsulates the absolute absurdity of the European position.
The story about the Danish ambassador.
Yes. Sachs says he watched her stand up and deliver this impassioned, fulminating speech condemning Iran's actions. But he points out an incredibly dark, almost unbelievable irony hanging over her speech. According to Sachs's sources, the United States is currently actively drawing up plans to effectively declare Greenland, which is historically and legally Danish sovereign territory, as American property for strategic national security reasons, essentially looking to annex it to counter Russian and Chinese Arctic ambitions.
So consider the profound cognitive dissonance of that moment. You have a senior representative of a European nation whose own sovereign territory is allegedly being actively targeted for appropriation by the American empire. Yet instead of defending her own nation's sovereignty or the principles of international law, she stands at the UN podium, completely ignoring American violations, to blindly parrot the U.S. narrative against Iran.
Sachs was so baffled by this display of willful blindness that he actually approached her directly after the meeting concluded. He wanted to express his concern about the Greenland situation, to see if she comprehended the geopolitical reality of her own country's position.
And her reaction?
She didn't argue. She didn't defend her stance. She simply looked at him, turned around in silence, and walked away. They cannot even tolerate the friction of engaging in the discussion. It's a total institutionalized denial of reality.
It represents profound, tragic institutional failure. The original architects of a unified Europe, The men and women who waded through the rubble of the 1940s and knew the true, visceral cost of unrestrained militarism would be horrified by this display. Because right now, according to Sachs, there is virtually no one in the upper echelons of European leadership possessing the historical sense or the political courage to stand up, look Washington in the eye, and tell them that this unipolar path is dragging the entire world into an abyss.
So how did we actually get here? How did the global mindset pivot so drastically from the devastating, hard-learned lessons of World War II to this current obsession with unipolar domination? To explain the root of the disease, Sachs takes the listener all the way back to the pivotal year of 1945.
He points specifically to the original foundational vision of the United Nations, which was heavily influenced and championed by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yeah.
FDR's grand vision for the post-war world was fundamentally rooted in genuine multipolarity.
FDR possessed the pragmatism to understand that defeating the Axis powers was a massive collective enterprise. It wasn't simply a narrative of America swooping in at the last minute to save the day single-handedly. Sachs emphasizes that FDR deeply recognized and respected the absolutely staggering sacrifice made by the Soviet Union, who lost an estimated 27 million citizens grinding down the Nazi war machine on the Eastern Front.
FDR's framework for the post-war world was based on the concept of the four policemen, a structural cooperation between the four major victorious powers, the U.S., Britain, Russia, and China.
FDR genuinely believed that for global peace to endure, these massive, divergent nations had to stick together. He didn't envision a world where they were constantly fighting proxy wars or trying to veto each other into submission. He wanted shared, balanced responsibility. He also championed the good neighbor policy, which was a vital pivot away from the old Roosevelt corollary. It explicitly opposed the historical arrogance of the U.S., constantly intervening militarily and invading its neighbors in Latin America.
But then history hinges on a single moment. Tragedy strikes. FDR dies in April 1945, just months before the war ends, and his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over.
And Sachs has a very clear, very harsh assessment of Truman. He describes him as a lesser person, a politician who entirely liked FDR's worldly experience, his strategic patience, and his gifted pragmatism.
The shift in American foreign policy was practically instantaneous. Sachs argues that Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan wasn't solely about ending the Pacific War. It was simultaneously, and perhaps primarily, a geopolitical calculation designed to impress, intimidate, and box out Stalin.
Under Truman, the U.S. immediately pivoted from viewing the Soviet Union as a necessary co-guarantor of global peace to viewing it as the ultimate existential enemy. This dramatic paradigm shift was permanently formalized just a few years later in 1950 with the drafting of NSC Memo 68.
And for those who don't spend their weekends reading declassified Cold War documents, NSC 68 was the blueprint. It fundamentally rewired the DNA of American strategy, solidifying the mindset that the U.S. was locked in a permanent zero-sum war against Bolshevism for absolute global dominance.
The nuanced idea of shared global responsibility that FDR envisioned was entirely thrown out the window, replaced by a mandate for massive military buildup and containment.
And this combative zero-sum mindset just fermented and hardened over the 4 decades of the Cold War. But Sachs argues that the real dangerous insanity, the true detachment from geopolitical reality, went into overdrive in 1991 when the Soviet Union finally collapsed.
Because suddenly the boogeyman was gone. The collapse of the USSR removed the only major credible check on American military and economic power. Sachs describes a literal madness taking over the Washington establishment, the intelligence agencies, and the military-industrial complex.
You suddenly had a single country representing roughly 4% of the global population, collectively deciding that it possessed the divine right, the moral authority, and the military capability to unilaterally dictate the rules for the entire globe.
Which inevitably leads to massive, arrogant miscalculations, particularly regarding how they handled the remnants of Russia and the rise of China. Sachs points directly to this post-Cold War unipolar delusion as the fundamental, undeniable root cause of the current war in Ukraine. To understand the blueprint of this delusion, he references Zbigniew Brzezinski's highly influential 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard.
Brzezinski was a titan of U.S. foreign policy, and his book essentially laid out the grand strategy for maintaining American global primacy in the 21st century. But Sachs points out a fatal flaw in Brzezinski's thesis. A key assumption of the Grand Chessboard was the belief that post-Soviet Russia was permanently broken, that it was too weak, too economically devastated, and too strategically defeated to ever meaningfully resist the continuous eastward expansion of NATO right up to its borders.
Sachs argues that was a profoundly delusional exaggeration of enduring American power and an incredibly dangerous denigration of Russian historical resilience. The U.S. establishment simply never factored in a scenario where Russia would draw a hard red line and actually possess the military capability to stand up to NATO expansion.
And we see a mirrored miscalculation with China. When China began its rapid, unprecedented rise in economic and global power around 2010, the U.S. hegemonists fundamentally panicked.
The established mindset immediately shifted from a policy of economic cooperation and integration to a panicked realization that China had to be contained, decoupled, and ultimately defeated to maintain absolute U.S. supremacy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Sachs really gets to the philosophical root of why the U.S. thinks this way. He argues this entire unipolar obsession isn't just a political strategy. It's rooted in a very specific, deeply ingrained Anglo-American philosophy. He traces the entire mindset of the CIA and the Pentagon straight back to the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes is central to understanding the security state's worldview. He is famous for describing the natural state of human existence, the state of nature, as a perpetual war of all against all, where life is inevitably nasty, brutish, and short.
Hobbes argued that humanity's only escape from this chaotic, violent anarchy is to submit to a Leviathan, a supreme, absolute, and terrifyingly powerful ruler to whom everyone surrenders their individual sovereignty in exchange for basic order and security.
Sachs explains that the modern architects of the CIA, MI6, and Western intelligence agencies have essentially taken this grim 17th century theory of human nature and applied it directly to the modern global order.
Their internal logic is uncompromising. The world is an inherently dangerous, chaotic, and brutal place. Therefore, to prevent total global anarchy, there must be a global Leviathan. Someone has to carry the biggest stick.
And the political establishments in the US and the UK firmly, almost religiously believe that they are the only ones fit to be that Leviathan. The underlying feel is that if they don't rule the world absolutely, they won't be safe within their own borders. It is the ultimate zero-sum game. It's us or them.
But Sachs counters this dark Hobbesian worldview with an analogy that is so brilliantly simple it almost sounds ridiculous until you really think about it. He calls the prevailing Washington mindset the 5-year-old on the playground.
It perfectly demystifies the grand strategy. He points out that, as a society, we successfully teach our kindergartners the basic mechanics of sharing a sandbox. You do not need to appoint one giant, heavily armed, dictatorial 5-year-old to rule the entire playground through fear just to prevent the other kids from throwing sand.
Right. You teach them how to get along, how to establish common, basic rules, and how to coexist in a shared multipolar space. Sachs argues that the exact same logic applies to nuclear-armed superpowers.
Multiple nations absolutely can share the global sandbox without needing one dominant, unchallengeable ruler dictating every interaction. The profound tragedy of our current era, Sachs argues, is that the hegemonists running Washington seem emotionally and intellectually stunted, trapped below the developmental age of 5, utterly incapable of comprehending a global architecture based on mutual respect and cooperation rather than absolute domination.
Now, to fully grasp the immediate danger of this worldview, we need to carefully introduce another massive factor in Sachs's analysis of this impending crisis. This brings us back to the immediate flashpoint in the Middle East, specifically regarding the role of Israel in this global web. We must be very clear here regarding the source material. Sachs uses intensely severe characterizations to describe the mindset and actions of the current Israeli government.
Yes, this is where his critique merges the geopolitical with the theological. Sachs characterizes the current state of Israel under its present leadership as a crazy rogue state. He argues that its strategic decisions are no longer driven by modern diplomatic pragmatism or the pursuit of regional stability, but are instead dangerously fueled by ancient 5th century BC religious texts.
He claims the leadership is operating on a historical, almost biblical mandate of territorial expansion that is actively instigating a potential Third World War.
To illustrate the extremity of this mindset and to show how deeply it has infected American diplomacy, Sachs points to a recent, highly controversial public statement made by the current U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. Sachs doesn't even refer to him as a diplomat. He dismissively describes Huckabee as a minor Protestant evangelical theologian.
During a recorded public interview, Huckabee was explicitly asked about the maximalist biblical belief that Israel rightfully owns all the territory from the Nile River in Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River in Iraq.
And Huckabee, the official diplomatic representative of the United States government, completely agreed with that premise. But it goes further. When the interviewer pressed him and asked if Israel could actually physically take that massive expanse of land, Huckabee casually responded, sure, yeah, sure, they could take it.
Sachs uses this incredible exchange to point out the terrifying apocalyptic synergy between the current leaderships of both nations. He concludes that Israel's extreme, religiously driven desire for absolute regional hegemony dominating the entire Middle East from the Nile to the Euphrates perfectly, seamlessly aligns with the United States' secular desire for absolute global hegemony.
It creates a catastrophic geopolitical feedback loop. The United States refuses to apply any diplomatic or military brakes to check Israel's regional ambitions, because those specific ambitions, destabilizing adversaries like Iran, Syria, and Lebanon, perfectly align with the U.S.'s broader imperial project of controlling the energy-rich region to box out China and Russia. Neither the Leviathan nor the regional power is willing to stop the escalation.
Which inevitably forces the ultimate terrifying question. If the United States, a subservient Europe, and an expansionist Israel are all structurally locked into this escalating cycle of conflict, who, according to Sachs, can actually stop this train before it goes over the cliff? Where are the brakes in this international system?
And Sachs points to a source of stability that will sound incredibly counterintuitive to anyone raised on Western media. He suggests that the only major global actors who might currently possess the institutional maturity, the historical patience, and the sheer geopolitical weight to stop this madness are China and Russia.
He views them not as the aggressors in this specific global dynamic, but as established powers firmly resistant to the U.S. hegemonic project, who might force a return to a balanced, multipolar world simply by refusing to be subjugated or broken.
He also raises a fascinating, nuanced question about India's current geopolitical alignment in all of this. India is a rising superpower that has, to a significant extent, signed on to the U.S. strategic project in recent years, particularly through alliances aimed at containing China.
But Sachs openly wonders what the strategic planners in New Delhi are actually thinking. He points out the profound historical irony. India suffered under centuries of brutal, extractive British imperialism. Why, he asks, would a proud nation with that deep cultural memory of subjugation voluntarily sign on to a new Anglo-American empire?
He suggests that if India clearly recognized its own long-term sovereign interests, it would reject this unipolar madness entirely and demand an equal seat in a multipolar world.
So after covering decades of covert history, the psychological profiling of world leaders, the collapse of international law, and grand Hobbesian strategy, what does this actually mean for you, the person listening to this deep dive right now? Because it's easy to dismiss this as high-level academic geopolitical theory that doesn't touch your daily routine. But Sachs's warning is fiercely, aggressively practical.
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, the core of Sachs's message is that this relentless, obsessive push by Washington to maintain unipolar dominance, this fundamental, childish refusal to share the global sandbox, is the direct catalyst instigating an impending, massive global economic and energy crisis.
This isn't just about lines on a map. This directly impacts your ability to survive and thrive. It impacts your cost of living. It dictates the exorbitant price you will pay at the gas pump to get to work. It threatens the fragile security of the global supply chains that deliver your food and medicine.
The grand strategy of trying to militarily and economically corner the world's energy markets just to starve out geopolitical rivals like China is a guaranteed recipe for domestic financial catastrophe.
And this brings us to the most vital takeaway from this entire analysis. Regardless of whether you personally agree with Sachs's intense clinical critiques of Donald Trump, his timeline of the CIA as a rogue deep state, his dismissal of European leadership as weak vassals, or his severe condemnation of Israeli policy, the historical pattern he maps out is essential to understand.
It demonstrates a clear, undeniable, decades-long trajectory showing how an empire's obsessive desire for absolute control inevitably, mathematically, leads to profound, violent global instability.
Thank you for sticking with us through this incredibly dense deep dive today. We know it is heavy, challenging material, but grappling with these uncomfortable perspectives is the only way we can begin to make sense of the overwhelming noise in the news cycle.
And as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building directly on the warning Sachs has laid out. Sachs vehemently argues that the desperate militaristic push to maintain American unipolar dominance is leading us straight into a catastrophic global energy and economic crisis that hasn't been priced into our reality yet. But what if that very crisis is the ultimate, ironic undoing of the empire itself?
Think about it. If the economic fallout, the crushing inflation, the severe energy shortages, the inevitable market crashes becomes too heavy for everyday citizens to bear, could the transition to a multipolar shared sandbox world be forced upon the hegemon?
Not necessarily by losing a military World War III, but simply by the sheer, grinding, mathematical impossibility of one single nation affording the astronomical financial cost required to rule the globe.
That is the ultimate historical paradox of every empire that has ever existed. The harder it squeezes to maintain control, the faster it drains the very resources and domestic goodwill required to maintain its grip.
Stay curious, keep looking past the terrifying headlines, and always keep seeking out the bigger picture. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.